Good afternoon. Today we have to see neoclassical poetry. The word neoclassical school of poetry lies within the period of 1660 to 1798. The main poets of the schools were John Dryden, John Milton, Oliver Goldsmith, Alexander Pope. The student in this class should be aware of the definition and style of the neoclassical poetry. The prefix neo means new, while classical means going back to the ideological said by Greeks, Romans during the classical period. Neoclassical poetry interviewed the new and the old together to produce poetry and dignified the human condition with no ornaments that mark the Renaissance. Neoclassical poets employed logic and scattered language to establish work of arts that mark this school, including John Dryden, Oliver Goldsmith, John Milton and Alexander Pope. Each one of these poets was a prominent figure during one of three major segments of neoclassical period, that is from 1660 to 1798. So let us take a deeper look at the features of characteristics of neoclassical poetry and some of the schools and related major poets. Now we will see what is neoclassicism, the basic elements related to neoclassical poetry or neoclassicism. Neoclassicism is nothing but a modern revival of the aesthetics and ideas of classical Greece and Rome, which are known as classicism, because neoclassicism purposefully meant to evoke classicism. There is not very much outward difference between the two. Neoclassicists were imitators of the notions that the ancient had developed centuries earlier. Features of neoclassical criticism would include an adherence to fixed standards of beauty, the veneration of tried and trusted ways, and an emphasis on craftsmanship in the construction of works of art. Neoclassicism is characterized by clarity of form, sober colors, shallow space, strong and horizontal and vertical, that render that subject matters timeless instead of temporal, as in the dynamic Baroque words and classical subject matters. The key points related to the school of neoclassical poetry included John Milton, Dryden and Alexander Pope and Oliver Goldsmith. Major works included epic and satire such as Pope's The Rape of the Lock and Milton's Paradise Lost. Neoclassical poetry is a poetry that presents a specific style that is characteristic of neoclassical period. Example, neoclassical poetry commonly features rationalism, realism, didacticism, objectivity and scholarly allusions. And now we have to move towards the word that we have uttered very recently, that is the rationalism. That the rationalism is the main and significant feature of the neoclassical poetry. Neoclassical poets viewed reason as the mainspring of learning, knowledge and inspiration for their poetry. Neoclassical poetry is a reaction against the Renaissance style of poetry. It is unique outcome of intellect, not fancy and imagination. Unlike romantic poetry, which is entirely the result of sentiments of the poet, neoclassical poetry is a simulated, fabricated, and stereotypical type of poetry. In romantic poetry, sentiments plays a role in writing of poetry, while in neoclassical poetry, reason and intellect are dominant elements. Romantic poets wrote poetry thoroughly at the impulse of their imagination. They did not lay emphasis on reason to compose poetry. The neoclassical poets made an effort to disregard imagination, emotion, and feelings while composing their poetry. That is the reason their poetry may be branded as artificial and synthetic. Realism. Realism is the stamp of neoclassical poetry. The neoclassical poets were not living in their own world of imagination. They were hard realists and they presented the true picture of their society. They don't have their eyes with the harsh realities of life. They were keen observer of the reality in their society. They reflected what they experienced with their open eyes in their poetry. These poets were not escapists like romantic poets who turned their back to the rash realities of life and tried to escape from them with the help of flight of imagination. Neoclassical poets were men of action and practically lived in the midst of people. That is why they had a very keen observation of their society. They avoided abstract ideas, imaginative thoughts, and idealism in their poetry. One of the main features of the neoclassical poetry was its imitation of classical Greek and Roman concepts. The neoclassical poets were undoubtedly great faithful of classical rules. The neoclassical poets respect the classical rules a great deal and they went to review classical concepts in their poetry by following each and every rule of classicism. Their highest concern was to adhere to the classical rule and employ them in their poetry as much as possible. Objectivity is an important feature of the neoclassical poetry as these poets were completely against subjectivity in poetry. They strove hard to write objective poetry. They avoided giving vent to the feelings, rather they dwelt upon the miseries, hardship and problem of people around them. That is why we find very little information about the lives of neoclassical poets in their poetry. Style of satire. The most popular style of neoclassical poetry was satire. Even though its form and language were logical and restrained, a dash of wit was always welcome. For example, poets were equating wit into their work by using an epic or ode to discuss a topic that didn't quite belong to it. It is true that the period between 1680 or 1668 to 1798 is known as the Augustan age or Neoclassical age. This period is also called the age of Dryden, Alexander Pope and Samuel Johnson, or the age of the prose and reason. It was a firm belief of neoclassical poets that the world is God's graceful creation with man midway in the great chain of being. The neoclassicism, Dryden, Pope and Johnson were real representatives of this age. The spirit of the age was analytic and exquisite and non-synthetic and natively credulous. The neoclassical poetry stresses on reason and intellect, that on passion and imagination. Kanziman observes that the literary transition from Renaissance to the Restoration is nothing more or less than the progressive movement of the spirit of the liberty. At once fanciful, brilliant, and adventurous towards a rule and discipline, both inspiration and inform, the neoclassical poets were champions of common sense and reason. They were in the favor of normal generalities and against the whims of individual genius. Dryden, Pope, and Johnson stressed on imitation of the ancient rules. The original works, Neoclassicism, have got echoes of classical writers. Here we have the transition from Renaissance to Restoration. These are the two main periods as far as the history of English literature is concerned. Initially it was Old English literature, Anglo-Saxon English literature, then the period of the Chaucer, period of the William Shakespeare, Restoration period, Romantic period, Victorian age, such type of the period, modern period. But in this Renaissance and Restoration period are very two important period, as there is a moment of literature from Renaissance to Restoration. In this moment, these three, that is the John Dryden, Alexander Pope and Samuel Johnson, played a very important role, and these poets were champions of common sense and reasons. The neoclassical school of Dryden and Pope was much influenced by the famous French writers of the period. Aristotle, the father of all criticism, thinks of epic and tragedies. It is true that many English authors turn to French literature for motivation and guidance. The most influential mock heroic poem were Lillian, written by Boileau, Mark Flegon by John Dryden, and the Rape of the Lock and the Dunciad, composed by Alexander Pope. We observe that the neoclassical neoclassical poetry is very realistic and didactic. All the poets of this age were men of action, whenever we go through the literary composition of these books are realistic. The neoclassical poets are extremely artificial and conventional in style. At their various poems, they use strange poetic diction in their poems. Satire was the deliberate forms of literature of the neoclassical age. In Dryden's verse, we find the use of satire to a great extent. Even the verses of Alexander Pope and Dryden are satirical in spirit of temperament. The literature of the Neoclassical period, that is 1660 to 1798, was much concerned with the life in London. The Neoclassical poet did their best to use many social evidences and contemporary controversies in the poetry. The true social picture of the contemporary London society has been beautifully portrayed in the satirical books of poems composed by Dryden, Pope, and Johnson, that is Samuel Johnson. Every heroic couplet consists of two comic pentatonic lines rhyming together. The Neoclassical poets draw our special attention towards beautiful and expressive objects. All the three Neoclassical poets have used heroic couplets in their different poems. Dryden, Pope, and Samuel Johnson are known as the great Neoclassical poets. Dryden is the greatest pioneer of the Neoclassical school of poetry. He was not only a great poet but also father of English literary criticism. His Absalom and Achitopol and the medal of political satire in the verse. His Macflan is a personal brilliant satire in the verse written tarnished the image of his rival poet Thomas Shadwell. The Hind and the Panther is also a very significant satire. His style of using heroic couplet has immortalized. His Mac heroic poem enchant the heart and the mind of the readers. Then the Alexander Pope, his famous poem, The Rape of the Lock. He has also a significant position in the Neoclassical poetry. And at last, Samuel Johnson, he was also one of the most important poet. And while concluding this part, I would say Neoclassical poetry has an artificial poetic diction. It is quite classical and pass on the realities of the contemporary society of London. Okay, thank you. With this I conclude.